Well, welcome, everyone, to our briefing today on the Bayh-Dole Act on its 40th year of doing great things for American innovation. And we've got the author of the Bayh-Dole Act, the staff author, not the one whose name is on the bill, but having been a staffer on the Hill, I know that's that can be something you don't always get the credit for, but Joe gets a lot of credit today. I want to welcome you on behalf of EFELDF Education Legal Defense Fund. I'm Jim Edwards, and I'm the Patent Policy Advisor. It's important to recognize milestones, whether it's in someone's life and family milestones or societal milestones. This is a societal milestone, the 40th year of the Bayh-Dole Act and all of its accomplishments to this time, and continuing as we speak. We're proud to be part of the Bayh-Dole 40th Coalition, and Joe Allen is with us and is the executive director of that. And I'll give a full introduction of our speakers momentarily. First, I'd like to introduce Ed Martin, the president of EFELDF Education Legal Defense Fund.
Thanks very much, Jim. And I just want to step in for a word of welcome and say thank you to all of you for gathering and for helping us, as Jim said, to mark this important milestone. We're very proud to follow in the footsteps of Phyllis Schlafly and what she has done in terms of these important policy issues around patent protection and also just around our Constitution at its heart. It was really important to Phyllis, and I'm sorry I couldn't be on Zoom more properly. I'm actually Phyllis also taught us to be involved in politics, and today is the primary in Virginia, and I'm working the polls and helping in my precinct. So, but I'm glad to join. And Phyllis Schlafly, it came to her through her education and her appreciation of our great Constitution. She believed that the protection that the patent system gives our American way of life is extraordinary, and she wrote on that in some particularly powerful speeches and writings. And we've compiled all those into a volume 4 of what we call the Phyllis Schlafly Speaks series. It's on patents and innovation, patents and invention. If you haven't got a copy of that, please let us know and we'll get you a copy. We're very proud, and she does such great writing and thinking on this topic. Again, it's Phyllis Schlafly Speaks, Volume 4, Patents and Invention. And while I'm thinking of it, let me say thank you to Ryan Height from our team, our communications director, as well as Joanna Spilger, who is our administrator in the main headquarters of the Phyllis Schlafly Eagles in St. Louis, Missouri, for doing that. Either one of those folks can be a help if you have any more issues. But I mentioned it was intellectual, and it was education, the Constitution, Phyllis's observation about how America worked, but it was also personal. Phyllis Schlafly's own father, who was a sales engineer at the Westinghouse Company, he used to work every night on an invention that he was working on the rotary engine. And he did receive a patent on the invention. It was not successful commercially, but it was very important to him, and it was his great work, and it was his great effort, and it motivated him in many ways to be able to get that patent and then to have the patent to recognize that invention. And Phyllis felt that as part of her relationship to her family and her father and to her life going forward. She realized that, and then she went and studied about the Constitution and really came to believe that at the heart of America, the sense of property rights, but more importantly, coupled with the patent protection, gave America this opportunity to succeed where other nations and other cultures had done good progress and done things, but hadn't figured out how to make things work quite so well. So today, as we're celebrating the 40th anniversary of the Bayh-Dole Act, I just want to underscore that Phyllis Schlafly also believed that you needed to get involved and find ways to make progress and make protections. And in the 1990s, especially when she was concerned about some of the Clinton administration's ideas on patents, and then again under Obama, she was active in writing and communicating. And we're very proud of being alongside and having Jim Edwards lead our efforts as our patent policy advisor. He's uniquely capable and also uniquely suits the Phyllis Schlafly brand. His goodness as a leader and as a man shine through, but also as uber competent. So we're celebrating the 40th anniversary of Bayh-Dole Act. We're also really clear that all of the billions and billions of dollars in economic growth and millions of jobs that started, and all the startups, all that's Bayh-Dole had a way of contributing to it. And also, we know we've got to be using these milestones to teach the next generation of leaders, the next generation of elected officials and staff leaders, as well as the people in the administration, about these facts, about how things work, and about the policy implications. So we're just very grateful to be together, and just want to encourage you, if we can be a resource on the education front, we want to do that. And also we want to be allies on making a difference in policy and politics. So I look forward to listening in, and thank you again. And any way we can be of service, please get to us through Jim or through our team. So thank you all for being here. Congratulations to Joe and others for all their good work on supporting the Bayh-Dole Act, and also continuing the smart policy decisions that can help keep America growing and keep America's inventors protected and looking for opportunities. So thanks again for being with us. Jim, I'll get it back to you.
Thank you, Ed. Well, Senators Bayh and Bob Dole wrote a law in 1980, and it facilitates the commercialization of inventions made from federally funded research. The law bearing their names is a hands-down success. Not only has Bayh-Dole enabled many inventions and discoveries to be made and to be put into practical use, it has produced a variety of positive spillover effects. More on that shortly. The reason for the Bayh-Dole Act's success, and the reason that Eagle Forum Education commends it particularly, is simple. Bayh-Dole secures private patent rights to the inventions that come forth from federal research funds. Senators Bayh and Dole did, as President Lincoln put it, added fuel to the economic interest of the fire of genius. This law states its intent. Joe did a good job making this clear, is to use the patent system to promote the utilization of inventions arising from federally supported research and development. The Bayh-Dole difference is providing universities and patent licensees certainty and commercial returns from reliable IP rights. So we have a stellar panel today to discuss Bayh-Dole and its performance over its 40 years. And I'm going to introduce them in the order in which they'll speak, and I'm going to introduce them all at once so that I don't come back and interrupt them as we move from one to the next topic and speaker. We're honored to have Dr. Courtney Silverthorn, the Acting Director of the Office of Technology Partnerships at the National Institute of Standards and Technology. Dr. Silverthorn is also the NIST Principal to the Interagency Working Group on Bayh-Dole. Joseph Allen served on Senator Bayh's Senate Judiciary Committee staff. He played central roles not only in writing, but in implementing the Bayh-Dole Act. Mr. Allen was director of the Office of Technology Commercialization at the Commerce Department. And there he oversaw the implementation of Bayh-Dole and of federal tech transfer matters. He leads now the Bayh-Dole 40th Coalition. Hans Sauer is Deputy General Counsel and Vice President for Intellectual Property for the Biotechnology Innovation Organization, the trade association for more than 1,000 biotech companies in life sciences. Mr. Sauer advises Bio on patent and other IP issues. Before joining Bio, Mr. Sauer was patent counsel for 2 biopharmaceutical firms. Jennifer Gottwald serves as Director of Licensing at the Wisconsin Alumni Research Foundation, also known as WARF. Ms. Gottwald holds a PhD in botany from the University of Wisconsin. At WARF, She licenses biotechnology, including research tools, diagnostics, drug targets and screening, and animal models. And David Korn is Vice President of Intellectual Property and Law at PhRMA, the trade association for U.S. pharmaceutical researchers and manufacturers. Mr. Korn earned his law degree at Harvard. He clerked in the U.S. District Court in Delaware and worked in private law practice before joining PhRMA. So let me hand it over to Dr. Silverthorn, and welcome.
Jim, thank you so much for that introduction and for the invitation to be here today. As part of the Department of Commerce, we are very proud of the role that we play in our nation's innovation and invention system, both in the obvious way through the United States Patent and Trademark Office, but also through the sometimes less obvious way in the role that NIST plays in the Bayh-Dole Act implementation. So I wanted to use my time today to talk about NIST's special role in the Bayh-Dole implementation, some of the work that we've been doing within our stakeholder community to find out what issues needed to be addressed in order to keep our innovation system moving forward for a number of decades to come, and then update you on some of our recent efforts to implement those findings that we learned from our stakeholder community. So NIST has statutory mandates, executive orders, and delegations from the Department of Commerce to have a very central role in the transfer of technologies. And this is both on the intramural side through the Stephenson-Weidler Act, as well as on the extramural side through our implementation of the Bayh-Dole Act and regulation. We are very pleased to be part of the 40th anniversary celebration of the Bayh-Dole Act this year. And since it's frequently referred to as a landmark piece of legislation, we understand that our role is central to keeping our nation's innovation ecosystem moving forward. In addition to our delegated responsibilities, we also have appropriated funds that go towards advancing lab-to-market initiatives. We are the conveners of both the Interagency Working Group for Tech Transfer and for Bayh-Dole, and also organize the Federal Laboratory Consortium. We have been a part of the lab-to-market activities since 2014, and we were very proud to learn in 2018 that the Trump administration had included lab-to-market in the president's management agenda. They contained 14 cross-agency priority goals, and the 14th, which is last but certainly not least, is improving the transfer of federally funded technologies from the lab to the marketplace. And this includes both technologies that are developed at our federal labs, as well as the technologies that come out of the $100 billion or more of research that the United States government funds at universities, businesses large and small, and other organizations. And so to best inform our efforts in implementing this CAP goal, we wanted to take an opportunity in 2018 to reach out to our stakeholder community to determine what challenges they thought needed to be addressed, and to set ourselves up for the best chance of success as we moved forward with our CAP goal implementation. We understood that the competitive environment for the United States has changed dramatically since the original Bayh-Dole and Stephenson-Weidler legislation was passed. And we wanted to make sure that we were solving the right problems. And in order to do that, we took on what I believe is the largest stakeholder engagement effort on technology transfer and commercialization. We did a number of stakeholder outreach efforts and combined all of this effort into something that we called the Return on Investment Initiative. This was to generate a roadmap for our CAP goal action plans. And when we set out to speak to the community, we said all options were on the table. Tell us your thoughts, so that we didn't presuppose any solutions or put too much of a government spin on things. So we launched this with the Unleashing American Innovation Symposium, which I think dovetails very nicely with the intent of the Bayh-Dole Act. We started that in April of 2018, had over 200 attendees. We put out our request for information for public comment. It was open for several months in 2018. We received over 104 responses. One person at NIST printed all of the responses out, and it was over 1,000 pages of information. I hope that he recycled them when he was done with them. We thank Eagle Forum for their input into the RFI as one of the RFI responses. Also, WARF and PhRMA were among the many participants in that RFI process. We also went out and spoke individually to our stakeholder communities and held 4 public meetings during the RFI period across the country. Conveniently, it ended up being 1 in each time zone, and spoke to over 350 people across those 4 events. The NIST director and other staff attended dozens of stakeholder meetings during this process, and we coalesced all of this information into the publication of what we called the NIST Green Paper to Unleash American Innovation in April of 2019. And the Green Paper, because it was designed to inform the CAP goal, is also structured around the 5 CAP goal strategies that were developed by the agencies and the White House of Office of Science and Technology Policy. The ones that are most relevant to findings on the Bayh-Dole Act were Strategy 1, which is to identify regulatory impediments and administrative improvements in technology transfer policies and practices. And Strategy 4, to support innovative tools and services for technology transfer. These drafts of the chapters were initially developed by the interagency working groups and the National Science and Technology Council's Lab to Market Subcommittee. We were assisted very greatly by the Science and Technology Policy Institute, which is the FFRDC for the White House's OSTP. It was based on public and agency feedback and also incorporated over 50 prior reports and studies on research and development, tech transfer policies and practices, including a number of prior investigations and outcomes of the Bayh-Dole Act implementation, and was extensively revised through both an interagency and a public process. We published that on April 24th, so we are just a little bit over a year out from the publication of those findings. And there were several findings that were related specifically to the Bayh-Dole Act. When we asked the questions in our public process, we got a wide range of answers from people who suggested that NIST needed to more heavily enforce components of the Bayh-Dole Act, such as march-in rights. Also, on the opposite end of the spectrum, people questioning whether we needed march-in rights at all anymore, and pointing to the fact that when the Bayh-Dole Act was passed in 1980, it was a new thing to the technology transfer offices, and that certain backup plans that the government retained might not be relevant today. We heard a lot, though, in the middle of the road in terms of how we might clarify terms, processes, and other implementation aspects to improve collaborations with industry. And this was related to the scope of government use licenses, the circumstances for exercising march-in rights, improving the waiver process for US manufacturing requirements. And this is really where the Green Paper settled, because as we heard from many members of the private sector, the only thing worse than a bad regulation is an unclear regulation. So we saw findings coming out of that inquiry that terms around march-in could be clarified, that terms around government use and the scope of the government use license could be clarified, and that we could vastly improve the waiver process for requesting exemptions for US manufacturing. We also heard an entirely different category of responses that were related to data and metrics. As many of you know, the implementation of the Bayh-Dole Act and regulation is delegated to NIST. But currently the National Institutes of Health manages the iEdison system, which is where many extramural recipients of funding report their inventions and their utilization of those inventions. There was a 2016 recommendation that was included in the analysis of previous findings from the National Academies of Science that recommended that NIST take on the responsibility of the iEdison system in addition to their regulatory authority. And so since we published the Green Paper in 2019, we have been very, very busy at NIST and in the interagency community to start to work towards implementation. And right now we have 3 pillars that are combining our efforts that surround the Bayh-Dole Act. The first is that we have agreed to the 2016 National Academy's recommendation and are in the process of moving and rebuilding the iEdison system at NIST. We had a fantastic stakeholder meeting just yesterday to get feedback from the extramural community on the initial design of the system, on some of the aspects that we'll be continuing to work on over the next several months. And we're anticipating that the rebuilt iEdison system will launch at NIST in middle of the year of 2022. So we're hoping to have a great big celebration when that is complete. We're also working through a very extensive informal agency process, and soon to be working in a more formal agency and public process to implement some of the findings of the green paper through the regulatory process. We are predominantly looking at ways that we can clarify things in the Bayh-Dole regulation, as well as things to streamline the Bayh-Dole regulation to remove outdated or unclear language or things that are redundant within the regulation itself. We expect this NPRM to address 6 of the green paper findings, and we are hoping that that NPRM, or Notice of Proposed Rulemaking, will be listed in the Federal Register for public comment later this summer. And then finally, we understand that regulation and systems are only 2 of the components, and we are also looking to host a prize competition later this fall to seek solutions from the community on how we might include and incentivize Bayh-Dole participation and Bayh-Dole compliance in ways outside of the regulation or the system itself. So if there are things that we can be doing to help the community continue the success of the Bayh-Dole Act, we'd like to hear about those, and we will be looking to have that open this fall. So I'm so excited that, that we're able to keep the momentum going from the green paper, and thank you to Eagle Forum and their input and their champion of NIST's efforts to continue the success of the Bayh-Dole Act.
Thank you, Dr. Silverthorn. Joe Allen?
Thank you, Jim. It's really a pleasure to be here. I really appreciate it. What I thought I'd do is give you a quick overview of why we have Bayh-Dole, how it works, and then some of the impacts it's had. And we'll have time for more extensive questions after everyone finishes. But in a nutshell, after World War II, President Roosevelt, as the war was winding down, President Roosevelt asked for recommendations. What do we do with this huge infrastructure we built up that helped win the war on performing research and development? That was something the government had really not done before. And we really did it excellently. In fact, you know, some of the breakthroughs that won the war came out of government-funded research. The recommendation came back that to help spur the economy, the government should keep on funding basic science. And that was something that a lot of industry didn't do. It seemed like an appropriate role for the government, and particularly through federal laboratories and universities. So that recommendation was accepted. And what happened was they put it in place, but at that time, the United States was basically the only functioning economy left in the world. So the decision was made that if the government funded even a small percentage of research and an invention was made, the invention would be taken away from whoever created it by the government and put in the public domain for non-exclusive licensing, which seemed, you know, I guess at that time seemed like a good thing to do. But what happened was it soon became apparent that while the government was funding great research, very little things were actually being commercialized. So the reason was that system destroyed the incentives of the patent system. There was no reason for the inventor to remain involved in trying to get whatever they invented commercialized. Senator Bayh-Dole, even though they were on opposite ends of the political spectrum, started looking at that because in the 1970s, the US economy started losing fields of technology that we dominated. So we asked the Comptroller General to do a study of what's the impact of government patent policy. And the Comptroller General reported back to us on the Senate Judiciary Committee that the government had basically had 28,000 inventions sitting on its shelves, with few of them ever being commercialized. And even worse than that, as bad as that was, he reported that not a single drug had ever been commercialized from NIH funding under those policies, because again, they destroyed all the incentives of the patent system and basically undermined what it was that President Roosevelt was trying to accomplish by having the government fund research. So Senator Bayh-Dole didn't agree on a whole bunch politically, but they did agree that you can't ask the American taxpayer to fund billions and billions of dollars of research and then just give it away and not have anything come back from it. So what they decided to do was to reestablish incentives as intended by the patent system into government research. And one thing that's important to keep in mind is the government is basically funding the original research. Sometimes they'll take it a little bit further. But these inventions they are not commercial products. They're more like ideas than a product. And unless someone in the private sector is going to commit years and years of their time and sometimes billions of dollars of their own money with no guarantee of success, these things are not going to be turned into new products. So Senator Bayh-Dole put together a bill in an election year. It was kind of the odd couple of politics because they were both on, as I said, opposite ends of the spectrum, but we started getting really good response to it. So what did the Bayh-Dole Act do? It basically decentralized technology management from Washington, D.C. to the universities and small businesses that make inventions with government support, so they had the incentive and the ability to own and license them for development. It also requires universities to give preferences when they license their inventions to small companies and to companies who will actually make the product in the United States. Bayh-Dole is not ashamed at all to say we want the prime economic benefit to come back to the United States. Doesn't mean you don't sell products abroad, but we were looking to make sure the American taxpayer were getting the rewards, not just new products, but also jobs and companies and all the benefits they should get back from successful commercialization. The Bayh-Dole Act also required that if a university actually got a technology commercialized, or a nonprofit organization like a research hospital, when they got royalties back, the royalties had to go to fund more research, to pay the inventors, and to pay the tech transfer costs. And one of the big breakthroughs of Bayh-Dole was it gave incentives to academic inventors now, not just to publish papers, but to also look and see, is there some economic value in what I just discovered? And the entrepreneurial revolution on campus is directly related to Bayh-Dole. Before that, you just had people publishing papers, and that was pretty much the end of it, which was a godsend to our foreign competitors because they got those for free and got a lot of ideas out of it, but not much was coming back to the American economy. The other thing that Bayh-Dole said was if the government funds an invention, they can use them royalty-free for their own purposes, which is basically going to be meeting their mission or funding more research. The government can also march in. Now, what do we mean by march in? It's very specifically defined in the statute, and as Courtney said, NIST is actually looking at making sure that we recapture the original meaning. But Bayh-Dole is very clear. There are 4 criteria for marching in. One is if it looks like a good faith effort is not being made to commercialize the technology. Then in that case, the government can have a hearing. If they find that that's true, they can require the university to license other people. Because again, Bayh-Dole's impact is get these things commercialized, get them in where they can actually be utilized. The other triggers are if it looks like a company can't meet the needs of a national emergency, then that's another reason why the government could march in. And the government can also march in if it looks like they've falsified their pledge to actually make the product in the United States. Those are the only marching criteria. There's nothing else in the law beyond that. The other thing Bayh-Dole did, which is really revolutionary, was we didn't create any new bureaucracy and we didn't require any new funding to implement Bayh-Dole, which is really astounding when you look at what Bayh-Dole's done, that it was one of the few laws put in place which didn't require a huge infrastructure. Bayh-Dole passed in 1980, and there was actually 2 other things that happened almost at the same time that really lit the fuse for a rebirth of American innovation, which has gone on to this day. One of which is the Supreme Court ruled that biological materials could be patented, which is a huge change there because before Bayh-Dole, the United States was actually lagging in biotechnology. And we were not really one of the front runners as far as commercializing new drugs anyway. We were falling behind Europe and Japan. The other thing it did was that we actually strengthened the US patent system. So we restored confidence that the US patent system actually meant what it said. The Economist Technology Quarterly has one of the best quotes about the impact of Bayh-Dole. I'm just going to read it here. They said it was possibly the most inspired piece of legislation to be enacted in America over the past century. More than anything, a single policy measure helped to reverse America's precipitous slide into industrial irrelevance. What's happened under Bayh-Dole? Now we have 300 new drugs and vaccines on the market. It's added 1.7 trillion to the economy with 6 million good jobs over 25 years. And before COVID, we were actually starting 3 new companies and commercializing 3 new technologies every day of the year from federally funded research. No other country comes close to that. So the bottom line is, one of the reasons Bayh-Dole is a success is it's an example of what can happen in Congress when people put aside partisanships and actually focus on solving problems. And I think that's one of the reasons why Bayh-Dole has been so successful. Thank you.
Got to unmute yourself, I see. Thank you, Joe. That was great. And now, Hans Sauer.
Well, thank you for having me. So I was asked to speak a little bit about like my experience with how Bayh-Dole works in practice. Like, what does it do for the private sector that, after all, is one of the beneficiaries of publicly funded research? And what does it do for the nation as a whole on an operating level? So I work for Bio, which is largely a small business organization. We have more than 1,000 companies. Biotech business is organized within our trade association, and 90% about of our membership are mid-sized or smaller companies, most of which don't yet have products on the market and will require years of more funding and work, if ever they bring a product to market. So I do want to put in a plug for the role of small business, small entrepreneurs in the operation of the Bayh-Dole ecosystem, because it is part of how the Bayh-Dole Act works and what it does for the country. To illustrate, right? Large companies, big, established, commercially successful companies, have a choice of the kinds of technologies that they choose to in-license, have a choice of the kinds of technologies that they invest in, and that they will decide to bring to market with all their resources of being able to create manufacturing chains, supply chains, distribution chains. Big companies can do a lot of things that small companies can't do. And that means they have a lot of choice, including the choice to in-license or not in-license technology that originated at publicly funded research institutions. On the other hand, this means there are a lot of opportunities for smaller businesses to step in, to establish a place in the value chain of biotechnology research, and to act as mediators between the institutions that conduct the basic research that is so often funded by the public, and be the intermediary between those and the large established companies that have the muscle to bring products across the finish line. Right? So there is, in the United States, more than in most other industrialized countries, a very large ecosystem of what we can think of as pre-commercial companies whose role really is to advance products up the development chain and often pass them off to bigger companies to bring them across the finish line. It's also important, I think, for present purposes, to remind the viewers that this is not all about medicines. Even biotech is not. Certainly our organization has a large segment of its membership of companies that work in the agricultural biotech space. Industrial environmental biotechnology is an important beneficiary of the Bayh-Dole system as well. Give you some examples, right? The Honeycrisp apple. You may not know this, but we all know the Honeycrisp apple. That was developed by the University of Minnesota quite a while ago. It was patented. It was licensed out to commercializers. Right? And it's become a really successful product. Consumers are willing to pay a big premium for Honeycrisp apples. And those are one result of a public research funding that was successfully commercialized in partnership with the private sector through the ability of license this kind of invention and technology to the private sector. It's not just apples, right? We're also talking insect-resistant eggplants, a humble sweet potato called the Covington, which was invented by North Carolina State, is as much part of the Bayh-Dole ecosystem as many of the important drugs and medicines that we have discussed and will be discussing. So how does Bayh-Dole work in practice and in our experience as small and mid-sized biotech companies? I would say on a macro level, Bayh-Dole operates really well by stimulating private investment, typically as a private follow-on investment to public research funding. And when you look at Bayh-Dole, you can think of public investment in basic research, public research funding. You can think of that a little bit as if it were an infrastructure investment. So just like the public funds road building, electrification or broadband access all across the country, the public funds biomedical research, basic biomedical research. And just like broadband access across the country creates myriad business opportunities for private business who start up companies, generate tax revenues and employment, right, on the basis of the infrastructure investment. Public investment in basic research operates in not very dissimilar ways, right? It creates business opportunities for companies to spend their own money to advance products, to employ scientists, engineers, to employ the graduates of the very universities that helped create some of the underlying science, and plow money back into the economy and thereby generate a return on investment that is surprisingly big. But quick back of the envelope calculation for you from the biomedical space goes as follows. We know that the United States spends approximately $35 to $40 billion per year on biomedical research, most of it through the National Institutes of Health. We know that 90% of that research is basic biomedical research. It has no direct application. It is far removed from any practical application or any concrete product that might be developed on its basis. We also know that only about 1/3 of that basic biomedical research funding later at some stage even becomes relevant to drug development. But we also know that the private sector spends another 80 to, depending on who you ask, another 80 to $100 billion per year on drug R&D, right? So if you just look at the numbers, depending on who's doing the counting and who's doing the calculation, it's been pretty well established that every dollar of public biomedical basic research funding generates a follow-on investment of approximately 3 to 10, and in some instances, $100 of private capital that is stimulated as a follow-on investment by this basic public investment. And this money gets plowed back in the economy, as I said earlier, and generates a pretty good return on public investment in the form of private follow-on investment. So the readout is not just new drug products or new eggplants or sweet potatoes, but the readout and the product is actually the stimulation of economic activity. That's where Bayh-Dole and the stable legal framework that it provides is, if you will, the grease that makes it work and operate to the benefit of the national interest. Really quickly, on a micro level, I have found, like in my previous jobs where I worked inside biotech companies and did deal with universities and did participate in licensing transactions from universities, that Bayh-Dole has created, I think, a very effective framework and network of technology transfer professionals who work at universities who have become, to my mind, particularly good at translating, I think, the interests of different institutions, universities, or federal labs on the one hand, and businesses on the other hand, working as translators between these institutions which have shared goals, right? Advance the research to the form of taking real life products, but very different missions. Universities' main missions are education and research. Right? Corporate missions are very different. Corporations must survive. They must eventually provide a shareholder return. So it's not easy for these organizations to talk and engage in licensing transactions. And I find that under Bayh-Dole, what has grown up has been a particularly effective framework of translating like these different interests and different missions into a shared goal of packaging these transactions into legally cognizable forms and make them work so that companies can take this technology and use their private funds to do this huge follow-on investment. I want to leave you with just one thought, which is relevant for current discussions about Bayh-Dole, and that is that in licensing transactions, and public-private technology transfer is a form of licensing. In licensing transactions, uncertainty makes the deal worth less, but certainty is value. Uncertainty makes the deal worth less. Great uncertainty may make the deal be worthless, so that it's not worth doing. And this is, I think, very important to current discussions we're having around Bayh-Dole. There's a lot of policy debate about whether Bayh-Dole, under the Bayh-Dole Act, should require more conditions on the way products, if they're ever developed, are going to be disposed in the marketplace. A good example are consistent calls for reasonable pricing clauses or other conditions of what should happen with the products that eventually might be developed on the basis of federally funded research with follow-on investment. And these conditions that are being proposed to be added to the general Bayh-Dole framework, universally we hear from our companies, are going to inject great uncertainty into licensing transactions, and many deals we fear would not get done if public policy were to be too heavy-handed in the way it interferes with the normal flow of licensing under Bayh-Dole. So I want to leave you with that and pass it on to, I guess, Jennifer, who is next.
Great. Thanks so much, Hans. I'm Jennifer Gottwald. I'm a Director of Licensing at WARF. I want to thank the organizers for inviting me to this, and I want to thank the other panelists, both for their thoughtful comments, but also for their important efforts that they're doing in helping American innovation through Bayh-Dole. I really enjoyed Hans's comments, and I think it's a nice lead-in. I'm glad he feels that university tech transfer has a good professional system that's working well, and I'd like to say likewise to the companies that we work with. I think under Bayh-Dole, we've been able to prepare great partnerships and work through these things efficiently, recognizing that we have goals that do overlap in some places, but are divergent in other places as well. So I want to talk a little bit about how Bayh-Dole works within a university tech transfer office and allows us to collaborate and form some of these partnerships with industry. So first, a little bit about WARF. WARF was founded in 1925. We are, if not one of the oldest university tech transfer offices in the United States. And we are a separate nonprofit foundation that handles the technology transfer, the patenting and licensing for the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Our mission is pretty straightforward. We want to enable UW-Madison research to solve the world's problems. And Bayh-Dole provides a perfect framework for this virtuous cycle. Federal agencies fund research at the university. Our great researchers at the university have findings and discoveries. We at WARF look at those and decide which of those could benefit from some form of protection in order to bring those discoveries to our industrial partners and collaborators through patenting and licensing, so that those industrial partners can then produce products and revenue. And some share of that revenue is returned back to the university to support further research and more inventions. So basically, Bayh-Dole, which was established to promote the utilization of federally funded intellectual property, guides everything that we do at WARF, and it's guided everything I've done in my almost 20-year career at WARF. I want to give you about 3 reasons why I feel that Bayh-Dole was especially well considered and forward thinking back in 1980, with kudos to Joe. One thing, we all know that working with innovation and intellectual property is really about relationships and trust. And I think you've heard this echoed in the other speakers. We need certainty, we need trust. When I'm forming a partnership with an industrial partner, we can start from scratch and figure out absolutely everything that's going to go into that legal agreement. But if we have the framework of Bayh-Dole, that provides some clarity and predictability. It provides government oversight in a way that incentivizes and rewards the utilization of these inventions. It gives clear guidance, sound structure, and a fallback option if needed. And I believe that the existence of the fallback option, such as the march-in rights, probably prevents a lot of problems from happening in the first place. As Courtney said, we weren't quite sure what was going to happen in 1980, and now we know that we really can operate under this system well. Another thing about Bayh-Dole is it decentralizes a lot of this work. I like to think that I, sitting in Madison, Wisconsin, know my university and my university researchers much better than somebody sitting in Washington, D.C., with all due respect. I see them every day during normal times, not pandemic, of course, and talk to them and know what they're doing with their research. I also know my local innovation ecosystem. So basically, by decentralizing this technology transfer, it provided a stable, it unleashed cooperation, innovation, and entrepreneurship at a scale that's really not achievable with a centralized system. And also, Bayh-Dole provides a stable framework with the flexibility to evolve and adapt to changing technology and business. We work in innovation, therefore we must constantly innovate. We must evolve. We must see what's changing within business, within technology. And Bayh-Dole gives universities the obligation and the latitude in order to fulfill that mandate. So Bayh-Dole was established to get the intellectual property out there and utilized for the good of the public. And these relationships under Bayh-Dole allow for certainty and allow for stronger collaborations within local ecosystems. Jim mentioned earlier kind of spillover effects of Bayh-Dole, and I think this is a big one, the collaboration and the partnerships we can form. With local control and clear ground rules, universities can work synergistically with startups and established companies, and we have the flexibility to mold the collaboration to fit any given industry and the needs and concerns of that industry, as well as any given geographic area, any given time, and the current financial pressures of that time. We are allowed to have that flexibility which we can work with. I think one large example of all of this, and we've heard about this from both Joe and Hans, is the biotechnology industry. The U.S. really leads in biotechnology, and it's an example of a relatively new industry that has very strong ties to universities and places very high value on intellectual property. And a lot of that came about because of Bayh-Dole and other things that were happening around the formation of the biotech industry. For a couple of more local examples I can speak to from the Midwest. So Madison, Wisconsin is not forefront in people's minds. I wish it was when they think about, say, biotechnology or technology hubs such as Boston or San Francisco. I will mention, though, it was a top promising technology development metro area in a 2019 Brookings Institution report. So we are getting recognition. We do have potential, and Bayh-Dole helps us recognize some of that potential. We can support our technologies. Within the past, say, 5 or 6 years, there have been 3 startup companies in Madison that had licensed technology from the University of Wisconsin-Madison through WARF that were acquired by larger companies such as Illumina and Accuray and Fujifilm. And sometimes when you're in the middle of the country, you think that acquisition is going to, suck up the good technology, make a good product, but it's probably going to be happening at the coast or even on the coast or in another country. That didn't happen in these 3 cases. Those acquiring companies recognized the value of the ties to the university and the way that the collaboration could work with the university, of the local workforce, and they kept and expanded their presence within Madison, Wisconsin. So we got 3 very large corporations with new presence in our city, which really helps grow the local economy. Another example that I see quite often, and my colleagues do as well, is some of the large multi-institutional grants that the federal agencies put out requests for proposals on. These involve universities, they involve companies, they involve local economic development organizations and such. And all of these grant applications and the ensuing grants that come out require all these groups to work together, and Bayh-Dole provides that framework. It can provide some certainty around what happens to intellectual property created under these grants, who's going to have rights to it and under what conditions. And again, it just provides the certainty so that these groups can collaborate more effectively. So in closing, I just want to thank everybody for listening here, and also really look forward to the questions that are going to come up at the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. David?
Thanks for inviting me. I work for PhRMA, the Pharmaceutical Research and Manufacturers of America. As with Hans, I work for a trade association rather than an individual company. Our companies are leading researchers and manufacturers of biopharmaceuticals, including drug and biologic treatments, as well as vaccines. Our companies participate throughout the research and development process for biopharmaceuticals, but today I'm here to focus on the important role of the biopharmaceutical industry in the Bayh-Dole research ecosystem, as well as potential for disincentives created if margin rights are used inappropriately. As you've heard, the Bayh-Dole Act of 1980 has had huge effects on industry, including the U.S. biopharmaceutical industry, and has benefited countless patients. As noted by others, the act was a reaction to Congress's observation that inventions and discoveries that arose out of federal research rarely, if ever, made it to consumers. And as the GAO reported in 2009, prior to the Bayh-Dole Act, fewer than 5% of patents in which the government held title had been licensed, and as Joe noted, none of them were for drugs. However, since Bayh-Dole was enacted, well over 10,000 new products, including more than 200 drugs and vaccines, have been developed through partnerships between the public and private sector, dramatically living up to the law's intent to promote the utilization of inventions arising from federally supported research or development. Bayh-Dole supplied a necessary element for the development of what has become the world's most successful biomedical research and development ecosystem. The ability for researchers and their institutions to hold title to patents on inventions they develop thanks to federal research funding. This move away from the government holding title to the invention, and instead it allowed for the research institution to claim any revenues from the licensing of inventions. It gives researchers and their institutions the incentive to seek out partners like the biopharmaceutical industry who can further develop these early stage inventions into useful products. The Act's emphasis on incentivizing development, commercialization, and use of inventions that benefit from government funding also provides the rationale for the government retaining margin rights to these inventions. Joe mentioned margin rights, and I'm going to discuss them a little as well. Margin rights enable the government to require the contractor, an assignee or exclusive licensee of a subject invention, to grant a non-exclusive, partially exclusive, or exclusive license in a field of use to a responsible applicant upon terms reasonable under the circumstances, but under a narrow set of circumstances. Margin rights are intended to counter the danger that a company might license a technology and then freeze its development in favor of a competing technology, or be fundamentally unable or unwilling to reasonably supply the intended market, thereby depriving consumers of the benefit of the invention. This is clear from the grounds under which government can exercise margin rights, which are limited to circumstances where the assignee has not or is not expected to take steps to achieve practical application of the invention, where health or safety needs are not reasonably satisfied, where requirements for public use are specified by federal regulations and are not reasonably satisfied. And as Joe noted, there's also a ground regarding domestic manufacturing. Margin rights under Bayh-Dole have never been exercised, and in every case where NIH has been petitioned to exercise them, it is determined that using margin rights was unwarranted and or would not solve the alleged problems raised by petitioners. Activists' calls to use margin as a tool to regulate drug pricing have also been rejected by NIH. As director of the NIH, Collins made clear in a recent interview, the margin approach does not appeal to us at all. He added that it does not appear that margin was contemplated to be used for an effort to adjust prices. Rather, he contrasted that with a limited situation where a product is simply not available because somebody has locked it up. In addition to being unsupported by the text or intent of Bayh-Dole, and having been rejected previously by the government, calls for aggressive use of margin rights could significantly chill innovation when we need new treatments more acutely than at any time in recent memory. Previous experiences with analogous policies have clearly shown that when the government restricts the integrity or the availability of exclusive license to patents, collaboration and innovation suffered. As noted in a recent paper by the ITIF, NIH's exercise of margin type rights on 2 patents under the Institutional Patent Agreement, a policy which predated Bayh-Dole but shared many similarities, contributed to the demise of what had been a successful policy and significantly delayed some important inventions. More recently than that, when a reasonable pricing provision was added to inventions that came out of collaborative research and development agreements, or CRADAs, between industry and NIH, those partnerships significantly slowed, only to rebound after the clause was lifted. Misusing margin rights could likewise poison the successful public-private partnerships, collaborations, and other initiatives that make up the US biomedical research ecosystem. They could stall licensing activities and lead to fewer promising inventions under active investigation, research, development, and likely fewer medicines. The Bayh-Dole Act has a 40-year track record of success precisely because it was carefully drafted to complement industry's capabilities and roles and those of federally sponsored researchers. Federally supported biopharmaceutical research is limited and largely focuses on understanding the function of molecular compounds, cells, and the human body, but far less on drug development. Industry, in contrast, uses its scientific and industrial expertise to take the necessary risk to find, build upon, and further develop promising ideas into safe and effective treatments that can be made available to patients. Without Bayh-Dole and the ecosystem it enables, federal research would be unlikely to reach practical application, industry would have fewer leads, and patients would have fewer treatments. As Dr. Anthony Fauci recently pointed out, we always need a pharmaceutical partner. I can't think of a vaccine, even one in which we've put substantial intellectual and resource input that was brought to the goal line without a partnership with industry. Without the IP protections that Bayh-Dole provides, or if its margin provision were to be misused, these kinds of partnerships could be at risk. The Bayh-Dole Act established the framework that has been essential in fostering a deep, enduring, and successful framework for collaboration between the biopharmaceutical industry and federally supported scientists that countries around the world hope to replicate. The biopharmaceutical research ecosystem that we have today exists thanks to the Bayh-Dole Act, as do many important treatments. Our current health challenges show that a healthy biopharmaceutical research and development ecosystem with efficient collaboration between industry and federally supported researchers in the service of rapid development of safe and effective treatments is of paramount importance. Thankfully, the Bayh-Dole framework is up to the challenge, as long as we keep it healthy too. Thanks.
Thank you, David, and thank you to each of our speakers today. We're going to turn it to question and answer at this point. I would ask our audience, if you have a question, to use the Q&A function and type your question and the name of to whom you are directing it. And we will hopefully get to many of those. Now, to give you time to be thinking or typing your question in that Q&A function, I'm going to pose the first one. In the age of the COVID pandemic and all of the rapid response, which was referred to earlier, of the US and other countries, but we're focused on Bayh-Dole, so the focus on the US company component, just really stepping up in an incredible collaborative unified, we got to get this done manner. I was wondering how Bayh-Dole factors into this massive COVID response on developing treatments, on the very rapidly tests and diagnostics and vaccines.
Well, let me take an initial.
That's for everybody.
Okay. Let me take an initial shot at that, because I think all of your people on here can really talk about what's happened. To me, it's remarkable. This is a World War II type mobilization of resources to meet a common problem, which I've never seen in my lifetime. And it happened. It's hard to believe now, but the COVID crisis is only a couple months old. You know, it seems like it's been going on forever. But the industry has shifted focus on a dime. Universities have changed their processes to make sure these things go to the front of the line. Even though people are working from home, you've got folks going into the laboratory because they say, we have to, this is critical, we have to be there. And let me just give you 4 quick examples off the top of my head about some of the things that have come out, I think really because of what Bayh-Dole did, as Hans says, is it stabilized the system. You know what the rules are. You don't have to worry about that. You can do the partnerships now, but if you have to worry about what the rules are, that's really going to trip you up. And no country in the world is even close to what we've mobilized. Let me just give you a couple quick examples of what's coming out. One of the top vaccine candidates is coming from Moderna. Moderna, according to their website, says, we quote, licensed pioneering discoveries from Harvard and University of Pennsylvania as part of the way they set up their company. They've also partnered with Dr. Fauci's National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases on developing their vaccine. And that, again, that's moving at rapid speed now through the FDA. I mean, it's going at the place the government never thought it could go before. If you look at drugs, Gilead's remdesivir is one of the top candidates right now. It looks like it has really good potential. It was developed in collaboration with the University of Alabama Birmingham's Drug Discovery and Development Center, also funded by Dr. Fauci's laboratory. So it's a perfect example of decentralization, get the technology there, get the bureaucracy out of the way, get the deal done, move the technology. If you look at the first 2 tests that the Food and Drug Administration put through on an emergency basis, one of them came from Cepheid, which was based on a technology that was commercialized by it was a spin-out company from Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, who took a technology and actually turned it into one of the first tests. The other test is coming from Mesa Biotechnology out of a Los Alamos National Laboratory test. Now, again, these are things which are done in months. There was some additional work there, but because of the incentives of the patent system, because of Bayh-Dole, and frankly, because the companies and public sector have stepped forward to fill the need now, it's remarkable what's happening to protect public health.
So I'll second all of what you just said and add in a little bit more from the perspective of what we see in the Department of Commerce. It's not just happening in the pharmaceutical sector. We see these types of collaborations happening at very rapid speed in decontamination of surfaces and equipment, of diagnostic testing, of all sorts of industries and tangential things related to the pandemic response. Within the Federal Laboratory Consortium, we've identified over 400 different news articles related to efforts that federal labs are participating in. We have been operating the Federal Laboratory Consortium in partnership with Autumn, and so we have both federally funded intramural and extramural technologies being posted related to COVID-19 in Autumn's innovation marketplace. There's also efforts within the USPTO to bring together resources and technologies from both federally funded and small businesses as well. So what we've seen, though, is that as these collaborations are happening, the tech transfer is also enabling the use of these for pandemic response. And we have been so impressed by how the private sector has responded to making pledges on the availability of future diagnostics and pharmaceutical treatments and vaccines. We've seen the response from the university community in a number of different pledge frameworks for non-exclusive royalty-free licenses to technologies. And so really these things are saying that the private sector is solving the problem and that government solutions aren't needed at this time.
quick add-on to that. So I want to re-emphasize what both Courtney and Joe said. Right? Bayh-Dole has enabled, I think, both the public and the private sectors to have as much as a running start on providing a solution as is possible under the circumstances. I just add one more thing, and that is, one peculiarity about the ongoing COVID response is that the industry and policymakers together are taking measures to ensure production capacity at scale for products like vaccines before we know whether these products are going to work and whether they're going to be successful. So this is something I think we all need to be very aware of, and that is very unique in the current response. Like companies are being asked to scale up manufacturing and convert facilities for the production of vaccines that are not yet ready to be approved. But this wouldn't normally ever happen. It requires large investments and large guarantees, I think, of the money that needs to be spent to be ready to manufacture these things if they get approved and when they get approved. That is very unique. And it is, I think, a signature aspect of the current response that is likewise greased, if you will, by Bayh-Dole, because if we didn't understand the rules and the legal framework under which we can do this, right, we wouldn't have been able to respond as fast. So I think we're very fortunate to have like an established, stable, and proven legal framework in the United States that everybody knows the rules under which we're going to operate and do this response. If we'd had to have invented this before starting on a response, we would be months behind.
And I'll just add really quickly, again, second everything that's been said, and to give a couple of examples of how we work with this and how Bayh-Dole has allowed us. On one hand, we have released some very small research funding for really quick projects for things like personal protective equipment, and know that we want to get the technology out there. These aren't things that necessarily we should be protecting by patent or looking at a royalty stream from. These are things where we can enable some quick research to really have a quick effect. On the other hand, we have a researcher, Professor Yoshikawa Oka, working on one of the vaccines, a dual influenza coronavirus vaccine. And we know that work's going to take a lot longer and have the kind of investment that Hans is talking about with infrastructure, with getting the production up and running. And that we're thinking about a different licensing structure so that that will actually see the market in a way that's fair to everybody and is accessible to everybody, but knowing that it's not going to be something that will happen in the next 2 weeks without much further investment on somebody else's part.
And building on the prior responses, I think you're right to focus on what already exists, the existing medicines and existing investigational medicines that exist because of the incentives of the IP system, and they have been involved with benefited from Bayh-Dole, as well as the structure now that allows the existing collaborations and future collaborations to hit the ground, as Hans had used that phrase.
Thank you all. Let me remind our participants, if you have a question, the Q&A function on your Zoom screen, bottom right, is where you go to type your question. And if you say who it's directed to, that would be great. We do have a question. The question is, are there any safeguards in Bayh-Dole against conflicts of interest by policymakers who also have patents or investments in one of the approaches to a problem, such as coronavirus? And if not, should there be any safeguards against public officials in policy-making roles having substantial financial interests in a particular approach?
Well, actually, the direct answer is no. Bayh-Dole doesn't get into defining conflict of interest. Again, we decentralize that, and I think you'll find every university, certainly the government, has got plenty of definitions of conflict of interest. In fact, some of them I think have gone overboard. And if you're talking about policymakers, then you're going to get into, if you're a member of Congress, you've already had some people looked into that. to the ethics committee. So conflict of interest falls outside of it, but there certainly are safeguards on conflict of interest. I was at the Commerce Department when we passed the Federal Technology Transfer Act. And as soon as we did, our lawyers wanted to come in with a whole stream of conflict of interest restrictions. And we said, no, we're not going to do that. We're not going to make these things up out of theory. Let's actually look at what we have in case and deal with it. Conflict of interest you deal with. You can stop everything by saying we have to prohibit every conflict. That's a management thing. You deal with it. And again, there's some things which are clearly unethical, clearly illegal. But for example, if you want to have somebody start a company on a technology they invented at a university or maybe in a federal laboratory, there certainly should be ways where you can do that because that's clearly a public benefit. So the direct answer is no, Bayh-Dole doesn't get into that. There's plenty of other people. Believe me, we're not missing any conflict of interest or regulations. And again, if something comes up which we haven't thought about, address that on a specific basis. But the last thing you want to do is tie everything up in knots by people's theories of what could be prohibited. And one thing about Bayh-Dole is it gives lots of flexibility to adjust the system.
Yeah, and this was actually an issue that came up as an ROI green paper finding as well. The conflict of interest statutes are actually in the criminal code. So the federal government takes them very seriously. But what we've seen in the past is that there is so little tolerance for risk management that we do tend to move into the risk avoidance area. And it does cause problems for entrepreneurship. It causes problems even when we try to bring people into government service who have had inventions outside of the government. In the case that their government service might somehow advance the value of a prior patent. And so that's a challenge that we've identified. There have been a number of studies that look at across the board outputs of universities versus federal labs, and there's quite a disparity for a number of reasons, but one contributing factor may be that the universities have figured out how to manage conflicts of interest, whereas the government tends to avoid them. And so when we start to have these conversations about things like entrepreneurial leave policies, and Joe, you said that I had to tell a joke during this panel presentation. So the joke is that in the federal government, if you want to be an entrepreneur, then leave, because we just haven't really figured out how to effectively manage those things yet. And it's something that we're hoping to look at in the future. We wanted to get some quick wins under our belt with the green paper implementation before we tackled the bigger issues.
Well, you get extra points for the only joke of the meeting. And actually, I laughed at it, so I like that. Good job.
It seems like if you have someone who is inventive and they happen to work in a university as a researcher or in the government as a researcher, that's a little bit different. They're getting their name on the patent and therefore being qualified for collecting some royalty payments that may accrue from someone who is a policymaker who, is maybe, there might be potential on a policymaker side to have some abuse, but it seems that would get a little bit dicey to try to manage if you're talking about someone on the administrative branch side versus someone on the congressional or I guess even judicial potentially. Well, thank you all for the answer on that. We're about out of time. Why don't we do one more quick question? And it's regarding invention. Has anybody looked at university researchers who are participating in innovation under Bayh-Dole, and specifically efforts to attract those who may be in underrepresented groups? Now, the Congress recently enacted the Success Act, which is geared toward promoting opportunities for more engagement in patenting, specifically women, minorities, and veterans. So anybody know about that?
Yeah, just one quick comment. The U.S. Patent and Trademark Office has looked into this because we know that in terms of the number of patents that are issued each year, that women and minorities and veterans are a very small portion of those. But I think that one of the biggest issues is that innovation efforts. If you try to incorporate more inclusion and diversity at the innovation stage, I think you're too late. I think one of the issues is that you have to start earlier in the STEM pipeline and to have more women, more minorities, more inventors who are getting tenure track positions or research positions and advancing through that in order to build up that career that enables them to get their innovation into the patent system.
Which kind of brings us back to Phyllis Schlafly. She, growing up, saw her father working on this invention over a decade or so, you know, as she's growing up and going off to college. And that model of someone, and she didn't invent, but she did produce copyrightable material and so forth. But if you are someone with interest and aptitude on science and technology side, then having some models that you can relate to seem to promote more engagement earlier, perhaps. So that's a nice thing to aspire to achieve.
Just one more quick thought about that, if you have another second. When I ran the National Tech, one of the things, as Courtney said, technology transfer, particularly, and innovation are things which a lot of people just don't stumble into. When most of us got into tech transfer, there was no such thing as tech transfer. Very little when I got into it. We just kind of fell into it. And when I ran the National Technology Transfer Center, we actually started a program to bring minority students into internships, so they actually get to meet other people there. Once they were able to meet the people and make the connections, they were able to actually do very well. And I know the Association of University Technology Managers, which Jennifer is a main component of, is actually looking at this. So I think one of the issues is, particularly in tech transfer, is to introduce people that this is in fact a profession. And if you have the aptitude, it's not just science, it's actually, as Hans was saying, a lot of it is personal skills. Can you actually talk to people? Can you actually make a deal? Can you translate what industry is saying back to your inventors? That is a really it's one of those things which is not a hard science, it's a soft science. And I think one of the challenges is to actually let people know, as Courtney said, before you're ready, actually, with your resume, before then to actually meet people there. We used to take our minority students to the autumn meetings and actually introduce them to people, so they had a sense of, hey, this is really something I could do. You meet the folks there, and it was amazing that if you have an entrepreneurial bent, it's like introducing a duck to water. You don't have to keep on prodding them. After a while, the ducklings that really like this are going to take off on their own if you, in fact, realize this is actually a profession you could get into. And again, a lot of people, this is just something we stumbled into, but I think it's at the point now where it's a main driver of our economy, and we can frankly use all the creative people we can find.
Any other comments? If not, then let me say once again, thank you very much to our panelists. I think we all have a better appreciation for Bayh-Dole and for the 40-year track record and for the prospects for another 40 years at least, and the many benefits that it has produced that we all probably take for granted on a daily basis. And the main thing from our point of view is the reason, and that is the secure patent rights that it gives. So let me thank each of our speakers. We really appreciate your being here, for your contribution. Great job, Courtney Silverthorn, Hans Sauer, David Korn, Joe Allen, and Jennifer Gottwald. Thank you so much. And I want to thank Rebecca Gantner, Ryan Height, and Joanna Spilger for their help making this virtual meeting actual. And last thing I'll mention is next Tuesday, the 30th at 10:30 a.m., we have another event called the Misadministrative State, featuring NYU law professor Richard Epstein and others. So thank you very much. Hope you can make that, and thank you all for joining us today.